Hi, so I'm Carolina and I'm here at the very beautiful Purple Valley Yoga Center in Goa. And today we are sitting at the pool area, so you may hear a little bit of background sound from our students that are having a good time in the pool. Anyway, I'm here with the Thailand room and Tim Feldman, and we are going to have a little exchange of words. I have some questions which students have given me, and hopefully Ty and Tim will be able to answer them. The first question is from one of the students. So typically, the pull towards a spiritual path or towards a different way of being is sparked by the experience of suffering or discontentment. The knowing that there must be a better way of living. What was this spark for you that pulled you towards your yoga practice or towards yoga?
Well, indeed, traditionally, it's thought that the first dawning of insight, of viveka kyatihi, consists in the realization that experience is pervaded in some sense by suffering, or by what Patanjali calls bad space, dukkam, which is often translated as suffering, but which can literally mean bad space. And that same idea is also expressed in the teachings of the Buddha as the first noble truth, that it takes that all experience is pervaded by suffering. I really like that in the Yoga Sutra it says specifically that that it takes discernment to see that experience is pervaded by suffering. And usually that kind of discernment, it seems to me, comes through, through a kind of a process of maturation. Like, as we know, yoga is not terribly popular among teenagers because they don't seem to have I think they haven't yet come to a certain realization, a realization of the sort that usually brings people to yoga, and that is, you sort of expanding the metaphor of bad space. I think most people come to yoga when they start to feel kind of cramped in the space of their own minds, or like they come to have they come to the realization that energy is not flowing through that space, or that there's, maybe even at the extreme, that there's not enough space within themselves to breathe, and so it's usually like right after the Saturn return in the late 20s, early 30s that people start to take an interest in yoga. That's how it was for me. And judging by the demographic here at Purple Valley of the students, that seems to be, especially if you ask them when they started, not that everyone's in their late 20s or early 30s, but most people indeed come to yoga around that time, because it's usually around that time that you start to realize that that there's a certain discontentment or something that follows you wherever you go, and that the resolution of that discontentment doesn't happen through some kind of rearrangement of your external circumstances. And so then you start to come to yoga to usually to find out whether a certain internal arrangement of circumstances can help better handle that experience of being cramped in our inner space, and then usually what happens through yoga, is that insight into the nature of that suffering deepens.
So before I go over to Tim, Ty, what is your personal suffering that brought you to the Ashtanga practice?
I was very depressed. I started doing yoga when I was 30, and I'd been struggling with depression for about, I don't know, the better part of a decade. And I didn't know what the source of my depression was. but it consisted, as depression does, in a kind of experience of I mean, it actually had, as many people's expression of depression does, there's sort of two sides of it. That was, I mean, I experienced what's called a manic depression, that I would sort of go to extreme lows that could last for many days, in which it was sort of difficult to have a positive spin on, certainly on myself, but also on much of anything at all around me. And then, that would usually be punctuated by a sudden upswing, in which, things suddenly seemed kind of overwhelmingly charged and beautiful, and often very sort of exciting and fascinating and interesting, and that would last for a few days and then it'd sort of plunge down again. And so the first time I went into a yoga class and I was invited to like move and breathe in this deep way that I had never experienced before, it felt to me on the very first day like I had a cinder block lodged in my chest, like a cement block. And I realized on that day that I had been carrying that feeling with me ever since the sudden death of someone who was very young, that I loved very much, of a best friend who was kind of a brother figure to me. And at the time of his death, I had no tools for processing what was happening, and I had also just moved from the East Coast to the West Coast to start a graduate program in philosophy. And he died the week before that program started. So I went back to the East Coast to his funeral, and then I came back to the West Coast to start this program, and I met all these new people, and I didn't tell anyone that my best friend had just died, because that just seemed like a super awkward introduction. So I just kept it to myself, and I kind of bottled that up, and then I went into this program that was all about keeping the prana in the head, intellectualizing, and fast forward 7-8 years, and I was a total energetic wreck. So that was my experience, and I also sort of knew intuitively somehow from that very first day that because of what had been revealed to me through that practice, that further revelation was possible, and that through that revelation, so I could sort of undergo some kind of some kind of dramatic shifting of that relationship with that grief, and then indeed, that's slowly what happened. So.
And did that happen with the practice?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it happened with the practice, and it was not fast. It took a long time, but it was remarkably complete, like in that I slowly emerged from depression through yoga. I mean, I would say that it actually maybe got a little bit worse, especially those kind of like manic episodes when I first started doing yoga, because suddenly I'm like churning and it's bringing up a lot. And so like at first that emotional roller coaster got a little bit more intense for many months, for probably 6 months. And yet somehow in the rest of my life, I was able to sort of handle it with a little bit more openness and ease, a little bit. And then, slowly over the course of years, that sort of depressive voice that was always like casting putting a negative spin on everything, particularly on myself. It didn't go away, but I started to hear it very differently. I didn't hear it as my voice anymore. I heard it as the voice of a certain wounded part of myself that I was learning to relate to differently, and then through that sort of shifting of that relationship, it's the content of that voice slowly started changing, and it's as if that voice grew less and less dark, and also started falling more and more quiet, and then at some point, probably a good 5 or 6 years into the yogic practice, I realized that I just didn't hear it anymore at all, and I really haven't heard it since. So, yeah.
Shall I repeat the question?
Thank you for telling your story, Ty. I haven't heard it before, so that was super interesting to hear. It seems to me that, as you are mentioning, and as the question proposes, that most of us are coming in with some kind of pain to yoga, and your story there, Ty, seems to me to be almost quintessential to what we hear so many people coming into yoga with, like either a emotional or mental, sometimes a circumstantial, like external factor, sometimes a physical issue that brings us in. We have this saying that we say just enough pain is what brings us into the yogashala. And just enough pain is what keeps us there somehow. Perhaps just enough pleasure is also what keeps us there. And in my case too, I came in just like you, not with an emotional, mental problem as the first one in the forefront, but a physical issue. I had had a big accident, and I was in rehabilitation, and I was getting back on my feet. And a friend brought me to yoga, and I started to do yoga, and in the same way that you were describing your kind of like a revelation in the first yoga class, I think I had that on a physical level. It was like my body said, this is what I need.
Yeah.
And it was just somehow I could feel the energy kind of like water coming into my body in the first yoga class. And I had this like very battered body after a large accident, too many injuries and surgeries and rehab, and very technical, trying to get back. And it felt like yoga was just coming in and soothing all of that. And then little by little, as my body was getting better and more healed, I think then the emotional, mental layer started to, reveal itself to me in similar ways as what you're talking about. But it seems to me that perhaps I have been gifted with a different mind, where there's a certain peace of mind which I almost take for granted these days, which is just there somehow. Don't get me wrong, that's difficult days. But my mind has not been and my emotions has not been what kept me in yoga in that same way. And for many years it was physical for me. The practice was super interesting for me. I came in from dance. I came in from a particular niche of dance where movement invention is was like the core piece. So just coming into yoga and starting to work with these movements was incredibly inspiring to me. But I think, Ty, you have talked about very clearly about the dogma from Patanjali and how realizing that there is a general state of suffering in our life and is the basis of a sustained yoga practice. And I think it is that for me too, and it's what keeps me in here.
On the same note, what is your responsibility as a teacher if you in your class or at one of your retreats have a student that is not emotionally well and perhaps need emotional support?
I think it's a case-by-case situation, and you have to try to figure out like what kind of mental issue or emotional issue that this person is struggling with, and then you have to see what that person wants to do with it. But I think the first thing from where everything starts working in the yogashala is trust. So there needs to be a base level of trust. And I think to create a base level of trust is also to make the student realize that whatever you go through, there's space for that here, there's good space for that here in the yogashala. And let's see how we work with it. Are you just coming in and you leave when you need to? Or are you coming in and I put particular requests to you that are very simple and not necessarily has to do with trying to make you better, but just creating a framework for you to be here, such as make sure you come in, do your sun salutations, do your standing asanas, do a few of the finishing asanas. Let's start there and see how it goes from there.
So good. I mean, I don't have much to add to that. I think, I think Tim, you're right to emphasize the importance of a space that is open and a space where people feel comfortable, a space where there's trust. Not only in the person who's holding the space, the teacher, but just in the whole ambience, and indeed in the whole process of yoga. And I mean, I think that's something that sort of emerges naturally. I mean, we both talked about how in our very initial experience of yoga, the body said, this is something that I need, and I think if anyone's going to really have a profoundly transformative experience with yoga, that's going to happen to them in the beginning. I mean, in the beginning of that transformation. Maybe it doesn't necessarily happen to them with their first brush with yoga, because that can happen in so many different contexts. But I mean, of course, Patanjali talks about Shraddha, trust, as a kind of, an essential, as something that's essential for the yogic process to unfold. And I've sometimes reflected that what he means by trust is not trust that a particular state of affairs is going to unfold. It's something much less definite. It's almost as if Shraddha doesn't necessarily even have an object. There's not something that you trust that such and such is going to happen if you surrender to this process, but rather just that you trust that if you surrender to this process, that whatever happens will be for the better.
Come what may.
Yeah, indeed. And so, I think that if the person that's holding space, the yoga teacher, say, for others to have an experience with yoga, believes that in their heart, then that kind of comes through and pervades the space, and that's really helpful. So.
If I can just add, I actually think that the Ashtanga method, where we have a set series of movement, a set sequence, is really ideal for this, because some of these strong emotions, they can really they can stop us in our tracks, they can paralyze us. And by just knowing what the next breath is, what the next movement is, can start to create movement where there was none, just on a very simple level, and starting to experience, even though I am caught in this emotion, I'm caught in this feeling, I'm caught in this knee injury, I can still move on. There's still life, there's still movement, there's still a morning that goes on, time's passing, and I'm part of it. I think it's still there. So I think the Ashtanga yoga practice can be very, very healing in that way.
Well said.
I have a next question, so I'm just going to put on my glasses here. Yoga offers us a clear, detailed method towards a particular experience of life. It does not ask us to believe in anything. In its purest form, yoga is completely free from dogma. And yet, the practice often offers us back faith, a kind of faith that doesn't require you to believe in anything specific. What is faith to you, and how does it manifest in your yoga practice?
I mean, I feel that, I mean, for me, faith is this idea of shraddha, or of having trust, you know, that come what may, it's going to work out for the better. That doesn't mean it's going to be pleasant. It doesn't mean I'm going to like it. You know, what comes up or what that sort of process of unraveling is like. It can be messy. It can be difficult. It can be confusing. It can be profoundly exhilarating. It can be pleasureful. It's always illuminating. But to have trust is just to sort of to trust in the natural unfoldment of this yogic process, the sort of natural unraveling of the mind. Because I'm often struck by the way that, I mean, we told these stories about how we suffered, you know, and, you know, you've obviously put your body back together in a miraculous way.
On a good day.
From where it was. And, you know, I told the story of overcoming depression over the course of some years. But what keeps me with it is this sort of progressive, sort of continuous expansion, really, a kind of deepening of insight, maybe. And, you know, the insights that one deepens into are not sort of, you know, further and sort of more sophisticated truths, but it's sort of like advancing in yoga seems to me more about understanding the beginning and understanding the basics and understanding just the basic sort of having an experience of the primitive movement of breath in a deeper, more subtle, more open and more illuminating way. So when you reflect on different things that you learned about yoga, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and think of the way you understand those same ideas or those same insights into yourself now, it's always so very different from what you imagined. The process of yoga itself, for me, is so very, my experience of myself is so very different from what I imagined it would be like 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And, you know, that is, I mean, it's just so fascinating to me, you know. And I guess I have trust, in that process, you know, from not only from feeling it in the beginning and sort of, you know, feeling that intuitive sense that this is going to be good for me, but also in sort of seeing what happens over time through a long-term yoga practice, like keeps me keeps me really passionate about it. Yeah.
Well, I think like the theme of trust is like coming back here in this one, and faith. And as far as I understand the notion of shraddha, of faith and trust, that's what comes in when logic finishes. It's not like what is there when we understand. It's like trust and faith goes beyond the logic, goes beyond what I know. And the ability to trust and have faith anyway is what that word kind of means to me, that there is the ability within us to surrender to what we know and beyond what we know. Because let's face it, if I can only have faith and trust in what I know, that is just too little to live, man. It's just not enough. So there's more out there than I can understand. And you are talking about the Shraddha Vidya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna Sutra, which I think is amazing in this relation, because without that trust that things are going to happen well, without the trust in the system, without the trust in yoga itself, without the trust in the authority of what yoga can do for us, well, there is no way forward, there is no vidya, there is no vitality, there is no embodiment, there is no possibility to take ourselves into action. Because why should we if there was no faith? If we had no faith that yoga was going to lead to a positive outcome, how could I even find the motivation inside of myself or the courage to start to do crazy things like put my leg behind the head, and jump back and all kind of other stuff that at least our parents think is going to break our body. So I think it is essential. I have a hard time with trust myself, or not, maybe not so much with trust, but I have a hard time with faith. I think in our part of the world, faith is often requires a leap of faith, and I am cynical and have a hard time not trying to break that down into its most logical components. So constantly like chipping away at that to bring as much logic with me forward, to be able to let loose the last little bit of surrender and just say it's probably gonna be fine. So I kind of in yoga work on that all the time. This is one of the reasons I'm still practicing. It's one of the reasons that I'm not just doing asana, that I started to look beyond the asana, to start to look at the philosophy behind, started to study the ancient text upon which our asana practice is based on, because I started to go, why am I doing this? What is it supposed to do for me? What else is there? But in regards to the question, I think that was also part of the question, said that yoga is not a dogma, and that in its purest form, we don't need to believe in anything. And I think I disagree with that idea of yoga. I feel very clearly that yoga is a dogma, it's a system, it's a thought, it's a point of view that has been put forth that is different than many other points of view. And no one really knows if it's by the end of, in its fine-tuned essence, if it's true or not. Is there Purusha? Is there Prakriti? Is there such a thing as liberation? Are there something else than the body? Are there anything like that? And yoga proposes that there are. And to some degrees, if we want to really push into the paradigm that is theistic, I think maybe where I can agree with the question is that we can choose if we want to take our yoga journey into a theistic direction, or if we prefer to take it into another direction, which is perhaps more my doing than God's help. But besides that, I think it's very clear, like there's an authority in yoga, it's Patanjali. There's a second authority in yoga, it's Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. And if we want to know what yoga is, we have to look there. That's the foundation of the system.
I mean, I do see it a little differently. I think of yoga not so much as a system of belief, although I fully acknowledge the depth and richness and beauty of the system of belief to which you're referring. But I think of yoga as a kind of process of unraveling, a process of consciousness developing, of consciousness expanding. And I think indeed we don't know. I think as an individual practitioner, I think it's important for me, I find it important to remind myself that I don't know exactly where this process goes. I don't know exactly where this leads. I hear the words of the many different voices of the tradition and the many different ways of understanding what Patanjali is saying. And I think as a practitioner, I sustain a somewhat agnostic sort of stance toward the dogma itself. although I find it extremely illuminating and don't help myself to any alternative dogma either. You know, I just, but I kind of allow the ideas to kind of seep in and out of my experience, trusting, you know, in the process itself as something that sort of underlies those ideas, and sort of allowing the, you know, the dogma, the theory of yoga to illuminate that experience in different ways, and finding that the way that I understand it from one year to another is sort of very, very different, you know, and yeah, so I keep, yeah,
But
please go ahead.
see, I would say that unraveling
Yeah.
and that evolution you're talking about is, I agree with that, and but I find that is embedded in the dogma, in the system. It is,
Sure.
you know, that the whole unraveling idea is that we let go of the kleshas and we strengthen the samadhi that we expand into
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
but don't get me wrong, I think there's also a very different idea from having a scholarly study of what it is and having it like in that way, like almost a black and white idea of what Patanjali and the classic commentators are trying to achieve, trying to do. And then there's practitioners like you and I, that we go in and that dogma, that shell of a teaching that is given, we begin to make that personal. We begin to experience what that means. For instance, Nirodha is a good example. If we ask most scholars, they would say Nirodha is that the mind is blank. There is no more movement going on there. And I think as a practitioner, as practitioners, you probably agree, like we have gradations of Nirodha. Like some days we're haunted by lots of thoughts and we can not really manage to do anything else and say, I'm just going to stick to my mat. And at other days, we actually manage to take some of those away and change them with some movements in the mind, which is useful towards the activity of yoga practice that we're doing. And then there's like the perfect day where things just start to open and become quiet in there. But yeah, for me, like these experiences that you're talking about, like I recognize them personally as part of the system somewhat.
Sure.
Even though they're very personal.
Yeah. I hear that.
I think the system came out of that kind of exploration.
I think so
that you're
too.
talking about.
Yeah,
It's
I think
like,
so too.
It's just
Yeah.
what do you do, like from having that experience and then trying to write it down in a mathematical formula that can be passed through time verbally.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean something really profound is transmitted through those words and through the teachings and, you know, through you know, it's almost like lines of energy for, you know, between people who've had some kind of profound experience with yoga and then are able to communicate, you know, something of that
I think Patanjali must have
to
been
others.
familiar with the state of samadhi, at least Sabhidya
Yeah.
samadhi. He must have been able to go there,
Which
right?
is extraordinary.
Yeah, there's not a lot of those around.
Because you wonder how he could still be embodied at all.
Yeah.
And have that kind of, yeah. I mean, there's a certain dynamic, or there's a sort of certain idea that's fundamental to the Yoga Sutra that I think that I know you're, and I mean I know you're really conversant with the Yoga Sutra, and so I know that you're conversant with this idea, and yet it's not an idea that I think most yoga students or sort of the yogic community is very conversant with, and for very good reason. And that's the idea that yoga is ultimately about, you know, the total disentanglement of everything that we think of as life and experience and energy and relationship and love and so forth into, you know, into something that we can only imagine, and that's very, very difficult to imagine with this yeah, something radically other than life itself. You know, of Purusha disentangling from Prakriti, the idea that, I mean, it seems to me almost to be something of a confusion to suppose that one could adopt as a personal goal that idea of yoga, because it seems to me that the one who adopts that idea, namely the ego, is utterly extinguished by, you know, by that yoga. And so it's as if the only thing that could possibly draw you toward that yoga, and I have felt this in myself, have been very much drawn toward that idea of yoga, is something like, you know, what the ancient Greeks used to call thanatos, the death instinct, you know, which was a spiritual instinct. You know, it had, you know, it's the instinct to sort of plunge yourself into the formless, you know, irretrievably. You know, you don't come back to your loved ones and share your experience of what it was. It's the you know, the sort of the deep aspiration of the heart, and I think that the heart does have this aspiration. I think it is inside of us. I think it really does live. To, you know, to sort of remove ourselves irretrievably from this realm. Yeah.
And the question is, you know, if that whole idea is just a tempting, wishful thinking, you know,
yeah.
like I think we've probably all been in a situation where we've just wanted to reboot and start over, instead of working ourselves back. But
or to recoil from our lives, you know, to recoil into a state of a sort of sedatives, you know, a state of numbness, you know, to you know, I want to identify, you know, with the eternal, immovable part of myself that's untouched by suffering, so that I don't have to sort out my karmic situation anymore.
Or, I wish I hadn't said that. You know,
right.
It's like, why did I say that? You know?
Right, to escape from that realm.
And all the pain and the ripples that it has brought for ourselves and out there, and just like as you say, recoil from that.
Yeah, to recoil from that. But I think that's something different. I don't think that's what really, I don't think that's the sort of deeper animating force and intelligence that draws us more deeply into yoga. Yeah. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's extremely, it can be extremely unsettling to realize in a deeper reading of the Yoga Sutra that that's where the yoga goes. Because I don't think that for most healthy minds, that's any part of what is wanted.
That's what we're trying to do.
And indeed, probably, you know, the fact is that for the vast majority of anyone who ever does yoga, there's no need to worry, because we're not going to escape from this realm, you know, in this life. And instead we find that process of unraveling is extremely liberating in such a way that allows us to sort of more fully engage with life, you know, to live an existence that is more open, that is more fluid, an existence in which we feel like energy can flow through us and through our relationships and through our situations, so that we can move through life more graciously, more easefully. It does have that.
Yeah, I do think that there is this organic, you know, growth process of the goodness that we experience in the world and within ourselves, that I would almost say that replaces some patterns that is probably potentially sabotaging our lives. And in the process of us getting better at being us, we start to let go of some of these things that you perhaps are talking about, and begin to become a little bit less clingy to perhaps everything. And I feel that in my own process, that has been a very organic process. I haven't needed to say, okay, I'm going to renunciate everything, you know, today in that way. But perhaps I could be a more
fa-
serious sadhaka.
No. Indeed, it falls off very organically. Yeah.
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 So I have the next question now from one of the students here. So, as teachers who have witnessed the rapid expansion of yoga across the world, how do you negotiate the balance between the need for yoga to change, evolve, and the importance of remaining rooted to the traditions and culture that gave birth to yoga in the first place?
I mean, tradition evolves. The way that tradition is understood and held in a community or in a practice, that very naturally and organically evolves. And when it doesn't, the tradition dies. It stagnates. So I don't think, I mean, I see myself, I see Tim and others participating somewhat consciously in that process, and yet not having to sort of, architect it, not having to sort of steer it to figure out, well, this is the way it really needs to go now, so we need to make the following changes. I mean, that's my experience of it, is that it happens very naturally. And Ashtanga Vinyasa itself is evolving, and but it's always been doing that. For as long as my attention's been on it, I've seen it go through many different phases and so forth.
I think it's, as you say, Ty, I think it's a very organic process. As a teacher, we look at the students in front of us, and as the demographics change, our teaching changes. When I have a body of students in the class and they do different than they did 10 years ago, I change accordingly. I teach different accordingly. Here's a very simple example. When I started to do Ashtanga yoga, I was told that the breathing was ujjayi breath. Everyone was told that at that time. These days, the last 10-15 years, it's been very explicit from myself, from Patab Joyce, and also very much from Shalaji, that it is not ujjayi breath, it is deep breathing with sound, or free breathing with sound. And then we can talk a little bit about what the difference is between that. But it seems to me that at some moment it was important just to get the basic idea down, and the basic idea was understood and applied, and then it was taught, and then perhaps it got pushed a little bit too much, too strictly into one direction. But then the students come back, and now they master the technique. So now as a teacher we can just say, yes, but a little bit less. Just chill a little bit on that whole idea. So I think that in that way tradition has been kept, tradition has evolved, and tradition has been detailed and texturized in a way which is important. And I think that's that tradition evolving in its most perfect way in that. I'm somewhat a little bit of a traditionalist. I'm still in a state where I'm trying to figure out what the heck is yoga. So I keep going back to India and study asana with Sharaji, and I keep going to India to study philosophy with my marvelous teacher there. So when I go to the West and I teach for people who has no idea what classic yoga is, when Ashtanga as in Patanjali yoga has no idea what that is, and I get a little bit, sometimes a little frustrated, but most of the time, I must admit, I find that when we are offering the information, even the most flaky, new, fun-loving yogis, they're usually very interested in it.
Yeah.
So I do feel that, and I myself came in from Vinyasa yoga. I did Jiva Mukti, and I was not interested in the philosophical part. And I think that yoga has this ability to open us up, to try to look for something which is a little bit more truthful in ourselves and in the practice and so forth. So I think that it's an organic process, as you say, it just keeps changing. And as you say, the traditionalists die. The strictest, the stock traditionalist will die. Of like stop teaching because there's no evolution, therefore there's like we run dry of motivation and so forth. To be able to keep teaching, we gotta keep evolving, and if we don't find a way to do that, we die as teachers, as educators, as knowledge movers, kind of thing.
You have the same tradition, but teach slightly differently. Do you feel that there is a difference to your way of approaching the Ashtanga practice and the yoga?
I think we teach a little bit different.
Of course, but everybody, yeah. I mean, everybody does. And I mean, I always thought that was such a beautiful thing about, especially, you know, in the first decade or so of my practice career, I would, you know, had the great fortune, as I know Tim has too, of studying with, you know, this just absolutely wonderful, you know, coterie of senior teachers. And seeing the way that each one of them expressed something that was singular and fundamental, something that was the same, something that was common between all of them in their own unique way, you know, and it struck me indeed that that's the way that these things evolve, and the way that they're given life is that people embody these teachings, you know, and then the way that they express them, it's always sort of colored by their experience and their understanding and their indeed their personality, and there is no, I mean, if you want to see what the real core thing is, the only way to do that is to listen to many different voices and sort of appreciate the underlying fundamental pattern. But there is no sort of one, you know, singular voice that could sort of express it definitively. So I think that's a beautiful thing, and not at all regrettable. So I hope we do teach a little bit differently.
I can only agree. I came out of the arts. I used to work with dance and choreography, and in the arts and in craftsmanship and all kind of ways, we see it again and again and again. There's some kind of master who is doing things in a particular way, and there's a group of people around that is learning that craft from that person. And when that person dies or falls away, when the master dies, then we have like we have different directions that comes out of that. And I think it's supposed to be like that. And if these, because every single person that has been around the master and taken in the teaching has hopefully learned the essence, and has hopefully figured out what does it mean to me and how do I work with this information. And they bring that information out in different ways. So, and
as of course indeed Krishnamacharya's students did.
Exactly.
Yeah. And again Pattabhi Jois's students.
Yes. And I see these days, so Pattabhi Jois, he died 10-15 years ago, and I see the way that Shadat is teaching, for me personally, is very, very much in line with what Pattabhi Jois was. But if Pattabhi Jois and Shadat was both alive, we would clearly see the differences in the way that they are that they're pronouncing the tradition. And I like the word you're using, singularity. There's a singularity. I often think about it like language and grammar. Like if you have put your mind to the grammar, you can speak the language, and you can speak it with different dialects, and you can speak it with different accents and so forth. But if you know the grammar, then that doesn't really matter. And I think that's also where ego, where personality and coloring has its great potential. It's like the best of that, you know, because we can go in and we can say, I am this imperfect entity with everything I got, and I will bring the knowledge through me with whatever I got. Whether I've got 3 fingers or 5 fingers, or I can talk or I cannot talk, or I'm funny, I'm not funny, or whatever we got, we use that.
Very good.
So I don't think I think there might be people that think that you and I, we teach differently, but I think that comes down to the symptomatic small differences, how do we jump back, do you start your breath in before your movement or after your movement or during your movement, or do you keep a quiet space between your inhale and your exhale, and I don't think it's important. Hopefully what has happened is that we've managed to make the system work for us with all our abilities and incapacities and talents and traumas.
So this is the last question. Can you please speak a little bit about the importance of having a teacher or studying with a teacher?
I mean, of course, absolutely. I mean, to learn, not only to learn technique. I mean, for that, it's of course essential. I mean, it is extraordinary how much you can learn from a book and learn online, that we've really learned in the last few years in the pandemic and stuff, that these are extremely potent resources and valuable tools. But there's no, there's no replacement for having a relationship with someone who's walked further down this path than you. And so I know that Tim and I, we've talked about this before. We're both extremely grateful to have been able to have these relationships with, with our teachers. And I think it is quite important.
I think it's absolutely essential. I totally agree. There's, for me to learn something alone, I have to rediscover the whole evolution and history one more time. I have to reinvent the wheel. So if I can draw a little bit on my neighbor, I can say, hey Ty, how do you put the left or the right foot first? Do I'm supposed to jump back here or not? Is a huge help. And I think that to some degree, as you say, we can Google that, but the answers that we get is so vast and infinite, so we don't know which answer to pick from all that.
Sure. And having an example of something more abstract too, like Shraddha, and seeing the way, and it's, I mean, for me, it's what's really potent is being able to know a teacher close up, to know more about them than they probably want you to know. Because then you really see how they embody, how they navigate their life, their personal life, their relationships, and then you understand how things like trust and compassion and dispassion and so forth are embodied, by someone who really embodies those things, and that's precious.
And also they can bring out the right word at the right time. And I feel the ideal teaching is that. It is not a lot of words, that might all be true and great, but it's the right word at the right time. It's the right
suggestion. For that
they
have to know you. They have to know more about you than you want them to know.
Yes, unfortunately. What is it they say?
Like in a good relationship.
Your guru should live 3 valleys over ideally, so you don't see their dirty laundry, right? So. But I think it's absolutely essential. I think it's also essential in keeping our own ego in check, because it doesn't mean that we progress in all the places where we perhaps talented already or invested already. I feel like our teachers, they tend to find our cracks, and then they help us see them, understand them, and work with them. And get that done. So personally for me, also discipline. Like when my teacher is in my room, I work harder. When I'm at home in my little hotel room and I'm on my mat and no one is watching, who knows what's going on in there. So without it. And also from another point of view, it's like like we have the Kriya Yoga system. Tapas Svadhyaya is for Prantanani. Tapas is our experience, but Svadhyaya is study what other people did with the same before we came there. And I just feel it's plain silly not to take advantage of other people in general. And if we can get that personified in front of us, there's just no other, no better way to do that. So. Yeah, teacher is absolutely essential. Go find yourself a teacher.
Yeah.
Slowly try a lot of teachers, figure out who works for you, narrow it down to one, keep going.
How do you know you have found a teacher?
You just know. You get cold sweats and
It takes some time, right?
it can take, yeah, sure. it can
Perhaps
take
we
time.
know and then we take 10 years
You
to
stumble
convince
into
ourselves.
it. Yeah, I mean, I think you stumble into it. They sort of, I mean, there's this traditional idea that the teacher appears when you're ready, you know, that you don't, you know, it's not something you have to do tons of online research maybe. But maybe that's helpful, I don't know. But
I feel I've spent 20 years of learning to be a better student. I'm still learning. You know, surrender, you know, in fact, how we show up, how I show up. But yeah, for me it has taken time to pass authority over to another person, like to give authority, to have that faith, to have that trust, and also to understand what is mine that I should not bother my teacher with, and what should I absolutely put on display. I think that to this day is difficult for me, you know, trying to negotiate that space.
absolutely,
But
absolutely.
yeah, so much to say
That's
about
rarely
that.
clear. Yeah.
So what?
It's difficult to see that clearly. It's rarely clear.
Yeah.
For me also.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Okay, well,
Fabulous.
if that was the last
you.
question, thank you for the questions, and thanks, Ty. That was
Thank you, Tim.